Bill, thank you very much, Bill, for being with us here in this Metaphor webinar. Um, we are really looking forward to hear from you. I was particularly excited that you accepted our invitation because in the cybernetic community, there has been a lot of curiosity about everything that you've been doing not only in your personal life, that is fantastic as an educator and as a system thinker, but also and a cybernetician, but also the experience that you are having in the School of Cybernetics in Australia. So we have heard many things, many really, really intriguing and interesting things about your approaches and experiments that you are doing with cybernetic education. So it is a privilege for us to listen from you of everything that you are doing and to learn from you. So thank you for being with us. Um, as we are a small group of people, I guess that we can, I don't know if you prefer just to go through the slides or you are happy to be interrupted and for people to engage in conversations all the way through.
I'm happy to go have a conversation if it's a quick comments, but part of it is that I want to make sure I get through it because they link back and forth. It's very tried to
Okay.
be a coherent. It came out of the conversation. Hello, everybody. I was having a conversation with Angela and John several months ago, or longer, actually before Christmas, I think, and the invitation to come and speak. And we were talking in general about our concerns that, whatever happened to cybernetics and systems and over the years, and it hadn't had the impact. And yes, the initial conversation was what's going on with the new school of cybernetics at ANU. But then it got into some discussions about the broader impact on the field and what was happening in the field. And in that conversation, part of it was say, let's explain what's going on and think about what might be done to help improve the impact of the field. And for me, it's cybernetics and systems. It's not just cybernetics, nor is it just systems. So that led to this notion that we do a little bit on my thoughts on explaining, my thoughts on educating, where I can talk about not only what's happening at ANU, but also the program, the Cybernetic Systems program at San Jose State that I led for a number of years. I didn't found it, but I led it, which was the first degree granting program in the world in the field. And then thinking about the kinds of ways to get cyberneticians and systems people to be engaging with sort of the critical issues that we're thinking about doing. So let's see if this works properly. Um, okay, there it does. So quick and dirty. I have those three topics. It's going to be, explaining, educating, and engaging. But I thought, given the circumstances and given the fact that this is a whole crew of people who think Stafford Beer walked on water without even getting his feet wet, and is enamored with all of the really good things and insights from cybernetics in general and the VSM in particular, that it might be nice to talk about afterwards in the bar and a quick comment on, beforehand in the bar. So what frames this is I did a bunch of work with Stafford in the early 1980s and other things after that. But this sort of sets up the theme. So very young in my career, I was asked to organize the 1981 SGSR conferences, Society for General Systems Research in Toronto. And because Jim Miller, who was president, the president usually did it, he was tied up with new responsibilities at the University of Louisville. And I said, sure. So I organized the conference, but on one condition that I said I did not want to focus just on systems, but I wanted to bring in systems and cybernetics and system dynamics. And I thought those are the three major strands at the time, and we ought to be talking with each other more often than we did. And they said, fine, you can do whatever you want as long as we have a good conference. And most of the conferences in the SGSR prior to that were attracting 70 or 80 people. We ended up getting 280 or 290 in Toronto. But out of that, so I had three tracks quickly for systems, Kenneth Boulding, for cybernetics, Stafford Beer, and for system dynamics, Danella Meadows. And then we had some follow-on events that occurred out of that because they were coming primarily around Stafford and Heinz. Heinz was there as well as Gordon Pask. We had a Concordia Symposium on Education that David Mitchell arranged. And then we had a symposium in Orono, Maine, that Barry Clemson, who was the president of the ASC at the time, did a joint symposium uh, looking at Beer's work and von Forster's work. And then 2 years later, I was elected president of the American Society for Cybernetics, and I organized a conference and did the same experiment. I said, I'll do it. All three, we had the same keynote speakers with threads, but I invited a lot of people from around the country, including journalists and, military leaders, officers, and a wide variety. So we had almost 500 people, 490 or something people at Los Altos Hills. And the theme in all of that was trying to develop a more integrated conversation between the key subfields within the systems and cybernetics domain at the time. And the quick point in terms of beforehand at the bar, we were having discussions at a dinner session at the Concordia Symposium, and started with after we'd had the meal. David Mitchell turned the podium over to Gordon to make a few comments, and then Heinz made a few comments, and then Stafford got up and made a few comments and told a story about Norbert Wiener. And I can go into it. It's a famous story, but basically he said it wasn't true, but it should have been. And then he asked me to come up if I had any comments, since I was the one that sort of precipitated all of this by inviting him to Toronto and working with David and Barry to get the other events happening. And my quick comment was that I was relatively new to the field. I'd only been doing it for 5 or 6 years. I was now at San Jose State and more actively engaged. But people kept asking me what's cybernetics. And my initial comment at a party sometime in DC and then in San Francisco was about freezing dead people. And the place, sort of laughed, and I said, but over the years I found two reactions at the time. And this was my comment, was that some people said, really? It's about freezing dead people? And other people would basically say, no, it's not. It's about computers. And here we are, 45 years later, and it's still basically the same situation for most of the people who aren't involved in our field. And so this is sort of the context for what we wanted to talk about in terms of explaining and educating. So let me try to do that. Make sure this works fine. Okay. Several quick points. We could talk at length about all of them, but what I found initially is that the point I'd like to make is that there are multiple perspectives and multiple influences on cybernetics, on systems, etc. Still, after 60 years in the field, 60 plus years, almost 75 actually. So cybernetics, some people think it's about computers, some think it's about AI, people think it's about feedback systems, others think it's about cognition. But for me, it's the universal science of purposeful phenomena, the original definition given to it by Norbert Wiener and the others, and still the core, in large part because I think human agency is the most significant and rarest phenomenon in the known universe because of our ability to transcend and manipulate basic forces that govern everything else and have since the beginnings of the universe. And cybernetics is one of the system sciences. So to me, systemics is this universal science of all phenomena. And then there's lots of different ways of approaching it. There's been evolution since then in terms of emergence of system dynamics as a methodology for being able to engage people in much the same way that the VSM is used to engage people in addressing complex issues. But there's also complexity theory, and there's complex adaptive systems, and there's a variety of other fields that have been generating more and more insights. But there's still this mixed perspectives, lots of different backgrounds. For me, cybernetics and systems are essential if you want to be able to do any kind of really significant work that's effective. For me, in that context, I found it useful to think about the field as a whole as an integrated paradigm. And the critical features are paradigms, people don't talk about paradigms as much as they used to in the 80s. I still think it's a really, really important notion because to me, there are different elements to any kind of paradigm that are not there's the epistemological aspects. How do you know what you know? How do you generate knowledge? They're ontological. What do we know about the world? What most people tend to think about as the science and what is actually usually the main definition when people are thinking paradigms. But there's also the methodological. How do you interact with the world? How do you interact with other people? How do you try to get things done? How do you apply the knowledge that we have? Um, but it also depends on the situational aspects of it. So trying to do something in the human domain is different than in the natural domain, trying to work in different parts of the human domain or the natural domain or the physical domain. So there are situational factors that affect any kind of paradigm. There are axiological ones that have to do with values. For example, in cybernetics, you can science a purposeful phenomenon. You can use that for good control. You can use it for bad control. And with all of these insights, and then what are the purposes, the teleological aspects to it? So to me, I haven't seen much explicit attention to this or recognition, but for me, that's the way I think about it, is that there are different aspects to a paradigm, and for my work, I try to integrate them as consciously as possible. Whereas in fact, you see different perspectives within the field. And a classic example is the work that's been labeled second order cybernetics is primarily epistemological, the focus on how we generate knowledge, how we engage in cognition and interact. It's not primarily about the ontological, which is often referred to as the first order cybernetics. But that's what I found helpful in explaining it to people. And I spend most of my time talking to people outside the field or working with people outside the field, whether it be students or have spent in my 50 plus years. Um, why is this important in terms of why should anybody else go to the trouble of learning about cybernetics or systems? As far as I'm concerned, it's because of the important notion of requisite variety, as Stafford emphasized, um, that in fact, you've got to be able to handle the variety of whatever the context that you're in such a way that it enhances human viability. That's what we're trying to do. So with cybernetics, the primary focus for me has been on human agency in all of its forms and the diverse capabilities that we're able to exercise as purposeful phenomena, both at an individual level and especially at a collective level. Whereas systemics, the focus is on the contextual complexity, diverse constraints, and it's that interface between your capabilities as a system and the context of the constraints and the realities of how those factors affect you. And you've got to be able to maintain it in such a fashion, as Stafford highlighted in the VSM, with lots of detail. You've got to be able to balance that in order to remain viable over a period of time. And so lots of different ways to explain to people outside the field or even other domains within the field, because not everybody's up to speed, as I'm sure all of you have experienced in different ways. Um, Not everybody in the field, and I would say very few people in the field have a full range or appreciation of what the field, for me, the field being cybernetics and systemics, can do. Um, so let's go to this. Here we are. Now, getting into educating, and I know this was your original question, Anja, so let me see if I can just quick overview. Um, the first degree programs, and we were particularly interested, I was interested in places where you could actually study this, that you didn't have to teach yourself about cybernetics and systems or read books or educate or talk with people. And I was finishing up grad school. I'd been learning about cybernetics, in particular work of Bowling and Bateson and von Forster, and then Beer, and then others. Um, and Joni and I were finishing grad school, going out to California. I'd missed the summer of love, so we were going out 10 years later. And I heard about this new cybernetic systems program at San Jose State. So I called up Norm Gunderson, who was the founder of it, who had been the dean of engineering. And had a long conversation, found out that San Jose was not down near uh, Los Angeles, like Dionne Warwick said, but it was in the Bay Area, which is where we were going. And he offered me a job as an adjunct professor. And 2 years later, I was head of the program and heavily involved in the field, trying to figure out how to educate people and interact with other similar programs around the world that had started cropping up um, in the United States, in Europe in particular. Um, the Cybernetic Systems program was primarily driven initially by educating working adults. It was a master's degree program only. They weren't allowed to offer doctorates, and they didn't think you could get the requisite qualifications at the undergraduate level. And it brought in people to help them figure out how to work more effectively on complex issues using computers and understanding some of the realities that the engineers and the other people working in what became very known as Silicon Valley. It wasn't known that when we first arrived in 77, but it was beginning to be referred to on a regular basis. Many of the programs that were then cropping up, whether it be at Portland State or Binghamton or Louisville or in Stockholm or in the Open University or in St. Gallen, they the emphasis was on helping groups of people engage in transdisciplinary activities, pulling from the expertise of the different domains of whoever it is, and in particular using these newfangled contraptions called computers to model and simulate and try to understand what was going on. So I did the first review of what was happening in various programs and trying to get them to talk together. I think, which is what led to the invitation to chair and organize that SGSR conference. Um, so there was a significant movement leading up to, and we organized actually Shel Samuelson and I and Jim Miller organized the session and George Clear on uh, all the different cybernetics and systems programs and trying to get them. We had a big conference in San Diego under gorgeous weather, pulling together, just letting people know what we were doing, piggybacking from each other, meeting at conferences. We were organizing sessions. So there was at all the SGSR and the ASC conferences, there were a number of sessions each year on education and the programs, a lot of cross-fertilization. The San Jose State program is killed out because of administrative issues at the university and significant financial crises and terminated after 25 years. So it went from 1967 to 1992. I stayed on at the university because by that time I've been a senior professor for quite a while, and it was a nice place to stay and raise kids, and I could do whatever I wanted. So I ended up teaching cybernetics and systems, but in the anthropology department and about 5 or 6 other departments in the university when I wanted to, how I wanted to, where I wanted to. But the field as a whole started ebbing. I mean, a lot of programs started closing down or became significantly diluted. Um, and then in recent years, there has been some continuity, and I hadn't kept up with the specifics, but then tended to be, I think, most of the trends, and we're going to find out more as we get into it in this project, of tracking what people have been doing and places have been doing. Um, Heavy emphasis on increasingly the computers, not the core of cybernetics and systems, but the technical aspects of it and the application aspects of it. Anyway, the new school of cybernetics at the Australian National University, um, Genevieve Bell, who is a noted technologist and social anthropologist working at Intel, she was lured back to ANU by the chancellor, who was a Nobel laureate in astronomy, I believe, saying they needed to build up a number of different um, new types of learning and centers of learning and ways of learning and educating be for the good of Australia. So they set up, I think what they had 5 different innovative institutes or institutes of innovation. And one of them was Genevieve was recruited, and it was focusing on basically humanizing and taking humanistic approaches to the development of artificial intelligence. And they had a 4 AI program for several years. And then Genevieve said, "Hey, this isn't working. We need to be more rigorous about what we want to do, and we need to have a new school of cybernetics." So she was a dynamo, and she got that approved at ANU, I believe in 2021. It may not have started until early 2022. And I was down there visiting granddaughters. We have our granddaughters are in Sydney, and I was asked to give a keynote for a systems conference and uh, for the Southern Hemisphere, which I did. And then one of the participants said, "Hey, do you know anything about this new school of cybernetics at ANU?" And I said, "No, I don't. Would you like to talk to the director?" "Sure, I'd like to find out what's going on." And what happened is they ended up making an offer I couldn't, because I'd retired. I'd been 45 years at San Jose State. I was writing and thinking, but I was living on the beach in North Carolina and going back and forth to Silicon Valley because we kept a home there too. Anyway, the new school is increasingly focused on cybernetics and broader aspects, including systems, even though that's not in the title of the school. The initial couple of years from 22, say through 24, was on the still the focus on artificial intelligence is a master's program and a doctoral program. The master's program is they accept, I believe, 15 students per year. It's intensive. They meet 4 days a week. It's required full time on that for the year. They have to work on a project, some kind of applied project, because it was in a school of engineering at the time. Uh, and then they started setting up a doctoral program. 2 years ago, in 2024, they did a reorganization within the university for a variety of substantive and financial reasons. And they are now in a school of systems and society that started with the engineering, what goes beyond that. And so the focus of the program now is increasingly on how you use cybernetics and systems capabilities broadly within dealing with the technological aspects and the human aspects and the ecological aspects. And they just graduated their first three doctoral students. And so they now have, so on a regular basis, they have 15 students in the master's program intensively, lots of different fields. And now they're beginning to get into doing students doing doctoral work. And those doctoral dissertations have tended to be less technical and broader and more strategic and focusing on the kinds of discussions you might have, for example, at Hull or you might have at St. Gallen, et cetera. So, bookends. Started with the cybernetic systems program at San Jose State in the late 60s. I got involved in a decade later, and now I'm at the Australian National University, and they're doing very interesting things, Angela, in terms of the mix and the conversation. And they very much have appreciated my ability to connect them with others in the field because I think we need to be involved. So that leads to um, this final point, which is that a couple of years ago, Matt Holt, who's the deputy director of SOCI is the School of Cybernetics. That's the acronym that's used within ANU. We thought it'd be a good idea because we were trying to get a handle on what had been happening, not only elsewhere, but throughout history. That was part of the reason they hired me. It was because of my connection with the cybernetic systems program you actually ran the first program in the world. So we thought it'd be a good idea to launch a project and looking at cybernetic and systemic education, past, present, and future. This is post-secondary. It's inclusive. It's not inclined to be more restrictive. So we're open to the kinds of education that are going on. Primary emphasis would be, degree programs because it's different to have a degree program rather than have a program in another field like management or ecology that has strong cybernetic and systems influences. just because of the nature of it. So we sent out a call for papers. We're doing a special issue with this SRBS, Systems Research and Behavioral Science. Is that still the acronym? I mean, what the acronym stands for? Um, and so the focus is on looking at this. We've put out a call for papers. I've pulled in contacts from decades ago that I hadn't talked to and seen who had retired, but they've agreed to write some things. For example, in the program at Portland State, the program at Binghamton, the Open University, Ray Ison's there. So several of you were involved with that. I know Angela and John are doing a piece, and Marcus is doing the piece. But our goal is to have a resource that would be easily available to anybody who's interested that says, this is what's going on in cybernetic and systemic education around the planet. There's more that's not in it because not everybody's responded, or we haven't been able to send an invitation to everybody. But the goal is to publicize the contributions and then promote greater connections among the different places and people who are particularly interested in education. We know some of that is not occurring in university programs. We know some of it, very interesting work, is doing in the commercial sector, but this is a start. So that's where that sort of stands right now in terms of the education. There is a consistent history since 67 when the cybernetics program started at San Jose State, but now sort of capstone, and I don't think it's the end of it. We're hoping that there will be more programs like the one at ANU. And it's interesting to see how that's playing out, even in the midst of some major financial issues that are affecting the entire Australian sector in higher education in particular. So now on to engaging. And this was where you could have more to say than almost any place, because it's, what's the role of cybernetics and systems? And what I have found to be the most powerful way to engage people over the years that I found, both in school and out of school, in consulting and policy work, is to recognize that we all live in a highly specialized world where you have different disciplines, you have different professional sectors, you have different cultures, we know more and more about less and less. And that's part of the reason we've been able to advance so much as a species. Um, so most everybody is living in this specialized world, and they've learned how to work and succeed and function effectively in their world, but it's hard to have connections across worlds, across disciplines, across professions, across countries. It's getting better, but it's still very, very specialized. And so I think the first major contribution from the field is that this is a transdisciplinary paradigm. We want to promote greater communication, I would argue communication and collaboration across different specialized domains. It can be disciplines in the academic sector, it can be different kinds of communities in the professional sector. But most of the most pressing issues facing individuals and the species as a whole is that we have lots of different people who have a good understanding of different parts of the elephant, but there are very few people or fields that are worried about the elephant as a whole. And that is where we come in. We have a way of doing it that is, it's not the only way of being transdisciplinary, but it's really powerful because there's a deep science to being able to understand the kind of world that we live in and how we shape it. I also think that it has what I would call metadisciplinary aspects. In other words, it's not just that we're transdisciplinary because of certain concepts or anything else, but if you take cybernetics and systems, you can provide a very rigorous explanation for how and why the world is organized the way that it is, from the physical level to the biological level, the ecological level to the social level. So it offers some specific insights that you don't necessarily get in other fields, although you see more and more people now in biology and in engineering, you pick whatever the field, there's there's much greater awareness, especially of the systemic insights that are coming out of the field that have been generated over the last 75 years, but also some of the deeper aspects of cybernetics. There's greater interest, for example, in the VSM, multiple domains, multiple places. Um, so that notion, we're still the difficulties. We need to be more intentionally engaging people outside the field about how we can help and work together to address these very significant challenges so that we as a species, as well as individual portions of the species, are staying viable in a very complex, changing world, which is largely as a result of our actions. The second point I'd make, which is where much of my research has been since retiring and that I've been focusing on, is how do you address the critical issues of the Anthropocene? And, this is not business as usual. This is a fundamentally different kind of emergent challenge. And so what we have is this escalating variety in terms of contentious people-centric challenges. But then there's also this emerging variety of these dangerous, increasingly dangerous planet-centric challenges. So if we keep doing what we're doing, and I've got an article that's coming out on one of a second volume of the cybernetics for the 21st century that Yaqui has been putting together. Uh, they're interconnected, and if we keep doing what we're doing, we're going to be in real trouble. I don't think there's any question that the planet's not going to survive because it will, but it may not be the kind of planet that is hospitable to human life, especially the kinds of progress and prosperity that we've been developing and are aspiring to over the last 500 years. So for me, I think it's important to frame the context of what we're doing is being able to address these issues in this time with much clearer anticipation about the imminent kinds of constraints that are going to be evolving as we affect the ecosystem around the world. No matter what Trump and the others say in the United States, when you live near the beach and you see constant beach erosion and tides are getting higher and the water's getting, there's clear evidence that something's going on with the weather. It's just not the same. And the scientists know, especially the climate experts, that there's all kinds of tangible consequences and projections. But we need to be thinking about that and addressing that as a more intentionally as a cyberneticians and system scientists, in my opinion. And then I think the final point would be that we need to be, as we engage the world and engage these issues and engage working with others on them, that we need to be achieving more effective and more responsible results. That we have these scientific insights, which is what, and it's a loose phrase, but this is how I would describe what we've been able to do from a system in terms of systems and cybernetics, and that we have much greater insights and knowledge now about both the substantive, disciplinary kinds of insights, but also the transdisciplinary. So we know a lot more about human cyberneticity, that is our ability to function effectively as cybernetic systems or purposeful systems, and also the complexity of the immediate context that we're wrestling in lots of different domains. But we don't have much discussion within our field about the historic insights that are there to learn about how our increasing cyberneticity and complexity has actually been improving and increasing. So, if you look at what happened, if you take a look at human history, whether you go back 10,000 years or 100,000 years or 200,000 years, it's a giant hockey stick from the standpoint of the 21st century. Just no progress, I mean, there's progress, ancient Greece, Rome, China, Western America, things, but fundamentally relatively flat until about 500 years ago. And it just started going up, and you start seeing the increases dramatically with the Industrial Revolution, then the energy revolution, then the information revolution. So we've had significant increases in our cyberneticity, that our ability individually and collectively to do things, but it's having paradoxical results in the sense of we have all these emergent consequences that are beginning to show up not only in terms of how people interact with each other, but especially the impact on the ecosystems around the planet, that we need to pay serious attention to that. And we're not doing that as intentionally as a field as I think we should. And so that's where I spend my time and effort. That's where I would recommend and hope that the field would be more involved in engaging with not only the issues of how you manage communities or improve the behavior of organizations, but look at these bigger issues. What are we doing in terms of the planet? What are the tensions that are going on in terms of autonomy and agency and viability? In that we're increasing our capabilities, but it's now running into the abilities of others, and they have their autonomy. And so it's very, very difficult to keep exercising or maximizing our own individual or collective capabilities at the expense of others who are trying to exercise theirs in similar fashion. So we have to figure out how to negotiate this freedom and democracy and do it in different ways. And I'm sure I don't know how much any of you are wrestling with these issues, but people are seriously concerned about climate change. And I think we're going to have more to fear, and we're going to have more deaths and more turbulence from trying to get people to collectively agree what to do about climate change. That's going to affect us long before climate change is going to actually cause physical damage to us. So, um, afterwards in the bar, um, one of this is a African proverb. I ran a program on global citizenship and systemic and approaches to global citizenship with the Salzburg Global Seminar for 15 years or so. And one of our colleagues did an awful lot of consulting around the world. And he had an African proverb that he related, which captures the essence of it, which is that when the watering hole dries up, the animals look at each other differently. And one of the cybernetic inferences from that is that you'd rather be a lion than a lamb. So here we are. We're in a situation where, to put it in our terms, our meta goal is how do we enhance people's ability to act more cybernetically and systemically? And I put it in red because we do act cybernetically and systemically in the sense of our ontological behavior, et cetera. What I mean is that how do we use the knowledge of cybernetics and systems and the capabilities of cybernetics and systems to consciously and intentionally enhance our ability to act more cybernetically and systemically so that it's a very self-referential recursive process. And our goal, meta goal anyway, is to enhance the human viability as a species. And so I guess my final comment would be that we've made significant progress in the 75 years since cybernetics and systems were all invented right after World War II. But we're getting farther and farther behind in terms of our viability on the planet. So what do we do about that? And the closing point was is that after a little bit of story connecting it back to Stafford, if you remember talking about his comments at that conference, the symposium in Concordia, and the laughs and his disbelief at my story about cybernetics being about dead people, freezing dead people. So we're leaving, and it was Stafford and myself and Heinz and Gordon. I think Paul Pongaro was there too, and Barry Clemson. We were all getting on a plane to fly from Montreal to Bangor, Maine, I think it was that we came into. And I was right in front of Stafford, and then behind it, I think Heinz had gone on. But anyway, we were going through, and there's a checkout at the time. You couldn't leave the country without going through customs. So we're leaving the country, and the gentleman there, who was probably, I said he's a really old guy, but I think he's probably just about my age right now. And I, at the time, remember I was in my early 30s. He said, "Well, what are you here for, business or pleasure?" And I said, "Well, I was here for business." He said, "So what were you here for?" "I was here for a conference." He said, "Oh, what's the conference? What was the conference about?" I said, "It's something you wouldn't, know anything about." He said, "What was it?" He just said, "Oh," I said, "it was about cybernetics." He said, "Oh yeah, that's great. That's about freezing dead people, isn't it?" And Stafford went nuts. He could not believe that this that happening. There we were, because we were all in line together going through. And then we had further conversations about that in Orono, and we had follow-up conversations in uh, Los Altos Hills and at other times that I interacted with him. The thing, I'm happy to share that, but it's with the mixed feelings, because in one sense there's insights, and it's enjoyable, and it goes back to some pivotal periods in the field. But here it is, 45 years later, since 1981, and we're still having issues of people not understanding the power of the field, the value of the field. And like I said, we've made significant progress in our cybernetic and systemic knowledge and our growing impact outside the field, but we're falling farther and farther behind as a species. And I think that's a real conundrum. So as my voice is giving out and I'm looking at the clock, as that was my closing point. I can still hear, and all of you who knew Stafford, he thoroughly enjoyed things, and when he would get excited and effusive about stuff, and that was just, I remember that. In fact, we called it the Magical Mystery Tour. This series of events that occurred from Toronto to Montreal to Orono, because there's a group of us of about 15 people that were in each of those events that was triggered by the SGSR conference initially. And for somebody new in the field, um, being able to have, you know, that kind of interaction with Stafford and Heinz and Gordon Pask and others, and Heinz was one of my outside readers on my dissertation. It was just a very heady experience, and there was an awful lot of insights that came out of it. But I still say, 45 years later, I'm concerned that we haven't made more progress as a species, despite all the improvements and growth within our field. So I think I'll close it there and open it up to whatever questions or comments people might want to.
Well, thank you very much, Bill. Really, really, really exciting. And I'm pretty sure that we are all full of questions. Um, I don't know who would like to start with questions or comments. Um, well, if there is no one, I will ask a question. I will start with a question. I would like to hear your response to your broad question, the last questions, because I think that well, at least John and me, who have been also working in these issues on how to um, how to use cybernetics to address the main topics of sustainability. And obviously, in the moment that we are living in geopolitics, in this moment with all the crazy wars and the way that we are using technology and systems and cybernetics, that is not exactly the way that we will dream to use them. Uh, how do you respond to your question? Your question is how to access cybernetics and systemically to enhance human viability as a species. What will be your own response to this broad question?
Well, I think two things. I mean, two quick responses, and they're not, they sound simplistic, but they're the best ones I can think about right now. The first one is that we need to be, as a field, talking with each other and more integrative among ourselves than we have been. We still have different And I understand it when you even in very well established fields, you can be an English major or a history major or and there are all these sub areas that people concentrate on. That's understandable. But if you go to eh, some of the fields that I spend time in, which are leadership, for example, or work on global affairs or in history still, um, everybody has a pretty good sense of what's going on in the field as a whole, even if they're not experts in it. So what we have is we have a relatively small number of people, probably more than it was when I first got involved in the field in the mid 70s. And there's a lot of variety, but we go to lots of different conferences. You go to the ASC conference and there's 50 people there. You go to the SGSR or now the ISSS conference, there's 50, 60, 70 people. You go to a Metaforum conference. We don't all get together. We're a small field in terms of the number of people who are working in it. We don't all get together very often and have greater conversation and cross-fertilization within the field. There are still people who think think in terms of I'm not doing systems work, I'm a cybernetician. Or there's systems people saying I'm a cyber systems person, but I'm not doing cybernet. Yeah, I'm aware of some of it, but no, I'm not. That's not my identity. So we have all these specialized communities and identities within the field, all of which have powerful insights and made contributions. But another story afterwards in the bar. I used to, when I was in grad school, my doctorate was in Russian studies. And I stumbled onto systems and cybernetics, and I reached out and I got to know Heinz and I got to know Kenneth Boulding and a variety of other people, and they introduced me to other folks. But it reminded me at the time of all the revolutionary groups in Russia at the early part of the century. And they had a common goal. The common goal was to get rid of the czar and bring down the czarish regime. But they spent most of their time and effort arguing with each other about who was going to be at the head of the line. And it was only an historical accident that the Bolsheviks won. And the Bolsheviks are just about the worst of the Russian revolutionaries that you would want to have in charge if you take a look at the leaders of it, because Lenin had much in common with Hitler, and both of them had much in common with the psychology and the attitudes of Trump. So they would have been much better off if it hadn't been for the historical accident in World War I. They never would have been able to take out the czarish regime. So I would spend, I thought they should have spent less time arguing about how they agreed or disagreed about what to do and figured out how do we agree on the common cause. I would say the same thing within the systems field. And I mean that with having been a member for a long time. I still think we're too small to not be cross-fertilizing more than we do. And so, for example, the systems dynamics folks, they have large conferences, much larger conferences in cybernetics or ISSS conferences now. And there's the complexity folks and the others working on complex adaptive systems. And people can't even agree whether the name should be systems or system sciences or systems thinking. And where does cybernetics fit in and how, I mean, so that would be one answer. The other is that I understand that most of us are involved with issues that are near and dear, and the areas that we're interested in. So in organizations or our communities. But these bigger emergent issues need conscious attention. And it's not just the sustainability part, and I don't mean just, that's not the right term. It's not only sustainability, it's not only, peace and war, it's not only democracy and freedom, it's not only, but these bigger issues and trends, especially integrating it with an historical knowledge of what has worked and what hasn't worked over the centuries. For example, one of my pet interests is the significant importance of agency, and that's why cybernetics is so powerful and helpful. And how do we figure out how we interact with lots of other systems individually and collectively that are trying to exercise and maximize their own autonomy. And people have been wrestling with those challenges ever since we began to emerge out of the forest. But it was the rules of the law of the jungle. Whoever's the strongest, fastest, smartest, richest, luckiest, they made the rules. And human history is relatively flat for a really long time. Things change when there started being greater emphasis on individual contributions and capabilities, especially as, I mean, there are a lot of different factors, but the critical breakthrough was the rise of Protestantism when they started questioning the authority of the church and everything else. And what we found, if you look at it historically, is that if you have greater variety within groups of people, rather than just a few people making the rules and telling everybody what to do, which is the way it was for most of human experience, you start having increased freedom, increased variety, increased opportunities. You have a whole lot of people that fail, they don't do well, but others that come up with innovations, creativity in the social domain, in the technological domain. That is huge. So we want to have this, we want to nurture the agency and the autonomy, but we want to be able to focus it so that in fact we don't produce counterproductive, unintended consequences. And that's what's been happening and causing the Anthropocene. So I would welcome and encourage more people in the field to look at some of these bigger issues and say, where do we put some collective brain power and expertise and experience? It's not just about thinking about things. And say, folks, yes, we're learning more, we're doing better, but when you look at the planet as a whole in terms of our viability as a species, we're falling farther behind. And and we have, I think, more, we cyberneticians and systems folks have more responsibility to address those issues because our expertise is in looking at the big picture and understanding emergent consequences and properties and behaviors. That's part of what we do as part of the essence of our field. That's not true of most specialized fields. So I don't know. Does that help?
Oh, yes, very much. Thank you very much. Really, really interesting. John.
Yeah, thank you, Bill. I mean, this is this resonates very strongly with a lot of the work that Anja and I do, as I'm sure you're aware. Um, the, the issue that we found over and over and over when you try and put these ideas into practice is that you can go so far, and then quite often you hit a brick wall, which is all to do with the paradigm that people's minds are working in, and as I'm sure you know, that we're trying to move from one paradigm, the old Newtonian Descartes linear logical paradigm, into a more systemic one, and one where we're looking at patterns of relationships and all the complexity and how that works. And for an example, we did some work in a hospital, and all the work we did with the doctors and the nurses and the people on the ground was great. And we're talking about autonomy and cohesion and all the viable system model stuff. And it all went incredibly well. And we made a presentation to the chief executive and the executive board, and he loved it. But the thing that killed it was the finances, because there was a totally controlled, centralized financial function. And the guy who was the finance director said, I need control of everything. And of course, we were trying to enhance autonomy at the operational level. And there was this brick
Right.
wall that we could not get through. And the thing I mean, a lot of changes were made, but we never made the fundamental changes of moving the control to the level where it was needed to have the requisite variety to deal with the environment, because they kept the centralization. And there are these paradigms that you hit all the time doing this work, and it seems to. I mean, the work that Andrew and I are looking at the moment is how we get some of these ideas expressed so simply. And as Carla said, I've been for decades attempting to get these ideas over in an accessible way. And we're coming up with a project we're calling Barefoot Cybernetics, which is to try and do that, to make it just accessible to even people who don't have any shoes. And it's going to be tough because, I mean, a lot of these ideas are different, and 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 I think, well, once you realize that there are these very deep issues that in one of Gregory Bateson's things, that all our problems are to do with deep and partially unconscious patterns of thought. And I think that's what we're trying to address. And once we can get through these paradigms, and I think it's coming, you see in all sorts of areas, people talking more about networks than about pyramidal structures, and people talking about collaboration rather than competition, and a lot of changes happening. But I think cybernetics needs to be at the heart of that in directing these shifts from one way of thinking to another.
I don't disagree with that. And in fact, that was what I argued in my dissertation years ago. With but I've learned over the years that changing paradigms is not enough, because it's paradigms and power. And a grid, most of the people who have and institutions that exercise power in ways that get in the get in the way of us acting more responsibly in terms of the emergent properties for the planet as a whole, or the hospital as a whole, whatever it is,
Yeah.
being driven by a different paradigm. And there, it's a tension for me. What I see is there's a tension between most people, individually and collectively, seek to maximize their autonomy, their ability to control what they're doing. And it's a lot easier to be in charge and tell everybody what to do than it is to have to negotiate that with others who are trying to exercise their autonomy.
Yeah.
So I'm a scientist, I'm an educator, I'm a consultant, and I agree wholeheartedly that it's a question of paradigms and thinking. I also agree historically it's been the rise of increased variety and of increased individuals and groups controlling things, that are decentralizing control and increasing the variety of ideas, of capabilities, of innovation, that has led to the increase in progress and prosperity that we've had over the last 500 years, ballpark. But you have other people that are operating from a different, and whether it be a conscious paradigm or not, and I'm oversimplifying it because it's all on a gradation, but at one extreme is everybody exercises their own autonomy, and they're trying to do so irrespective of what anybody else does. Their job is their goal is to get ahead, and that means control what's happening. The other side of it is that that you can say, wait, we're living in a world where other people, other institutions, other members of the species are trying to maximize their agency too. So there's three things you can do, three options, three basic strategies. One is that you can try to force and maximize your own autonomy at their expense.
Hmm.
Or you can say at the other extreme, I don't have enough variety. I can't exercise my autonomy. They're more powerful, they're richer, they're faster, they're stronger, whatever it is, and you give into it. Or, and that's just two sides of the same coin, actually. Or you say, we all have power, we all have autonomy, we have identity. Now, how do we negotiate that? And what I have found when I first started uh, being all excited about being a cybernetician and system scientist. It was all about paradigm changes. It was all about engaging people. And I learned with two different sets of clients or groups that just sharing that wasn't enough. And I did that with the students, and they were in a program to learn about cybernetics, but still they had all these different areas of expertise and background, and they didn't just take for granted what I was professing. And the other was that with clients, because I started giving people saying, hey, would you be willing to help my organization? So I ended up doing an awful lot of consulting. Over the years, I spent more time and made more money consulting and working on policy stuff than I did in as a professor. And I learned early on, fortunately, got bruised a little here and there, but I learned early on is that it wasn't my job and it wasn't going to be very helpful for me to try to convince somebody else or persuade them that they should change their paradigm. I found it much more effective, especially when they asked, how would you help me on this? I said, are you happy with the situation you're in? And if you are, then let's have a beer, go to the bar, and just chat about things. But if you're not happy with your situation, would you like to figure out some way of improving it? So it became much more, my whole career shifted pretty quickly within a year or two. I changed my teaching. We had twins, boy and girl twins. We changed our parenting to the focus on saying, okay, what's in it for you? Not what's in it for me. I'm not going to come here selling you something. It's how do we engage you? What are the problems you're having? Are you having some issues? Well, if there's some issues, I think I can help. And in a conversation, we can collaborate. And I found that's where you started. And I had some people, and I used to say, if you if you're not having any issues right now, great. But keep it in mind because you're going to find some things that you're not happy about. Everybody's runs in situations they're not happy with what they're doing or what's happening to them. I said, if you then want to figure out how to begin to address it. So it was, if they don't have the interest, whether it be a company or a country or individuals or students in a class or anything else, it's, they're not going to really pay any attention, not really going to engage in any kind of meaningful conversation or improvements because they don't have any skin in the game. And that changed everything that I was doing. So it came down to, all right. And of course, very quickly, everybody's got something they'd like to improve that they're not happy about. And then part of it is you run to it, you need to change your thinking. You need to change how you do things. And it opens it up for a conversation. And I don't mean just in the Pascal sense or anything like that. It just opens up to not a situation where they have their issues or their problems, and you're coming in as an outside expert to help them solve their problems, but a collaboration between taking my expertise or your expertise or anything else and capabilities combined with their issues and their capabilities and saying, okay, how do we construct something that might be an improvement? And of course, it'd be better to have an improvement that actually deals with the issues before they become overwhelming rather than, too little, too late. So,
Okay, thank you. Yeah. I mean, certainly the way we work is I mean, I hate this word intervention. This thing about cyberneticians coming in and doing an intervention. It always feels much more like a dance that you get involved and you've got certain ideas, they've got certain ideas, and you just evolve things together. And that always seems to work far better. So, but thank you, Bill. That was very useful.
and interesting, just as a nitpicking, because we're having this conversation here, you said when cyberneticians come in. I've had similar conversations when they don't identify themselves as cyberneticians, they identify themselves as system scientists or systems thinkers, but they're making the same kind of observations.
Yeah.
And that's why I think there's been cross-fertilization. I think we ought to recognize that there are significant strengths, not just historical patterns and identities and communities, but significant strengths from cybernetics to be focusing on what human beings do and what we're capable of doing. But systems people are making some of those too. One general pattern that I've observed over the years is that almost everybody takes for granted that people are agents and can act. Oh yeah, you can get up, you breathe, you can walk, you can do this, you can do that. We all take it for granted. And it's sort of like a fish's view of water. It's there. And so I think the value of cybernetics is that it really focuses attention for me. There are lots of different contributions from the field, but it really focuses on say, okay, we have people who have very sophisticated and powerful ways of acting, of exercising agency, both to get themselves and engage with others. We need to understand how to do that better. We can't take it for granted. But we also have to recognize that when we act and when we interact with each other, we have impacts on them, but also on our world around us. And we've made things a lot better in many ways, but a lot more complicated. And so there's that we're in it together kind of situation, and don't take for granted that in fact almost all the solutions or the improvements are going to come through collaboration and cooperation with people having different areas of expertise. It's the difference, the variety that we have as a species in whatever group is how do you muster that in a way that's going to be effective for the conditions and the constraints that you're in.
Hmm.
And yes, up until now, the machine age, paradigm, it's a lot better than it was, 20 years ago, 40 years ago, but it's still prevalent. It's because if I have to adjust to other people's interactions, then it's much easier for me to control them if I can than it is to have to accommodate. So,
Thank you, Bill and John. Fascinating conversation. Marcus.
Thank you, Angela. Hi, Bill, and
hello, how are
thank
you?
you. Yeah, all right. All right, after your lecture, and thank you for this insightful talk. I have a double question. The first relates to all these systems department that closed down, which you mentioned. What at this time is your take or your view on the dynamics or the momentum of the systems movement? And my second question is, well, as a systems scientist in this world, you face increasing specialization. So how should systemists face that to improve the momentum of the systems approach?
There are two aspects of the same question to me, if I hear you
Yes,
correctly.
yes.
That's the way I read it and see it. And those of us who work in the academy, it's in some ways the most specialized domain you're going to be in as a profession. Because yes, you have specialization in lots of different other domains, but my experience has been that we have expertise and it's very specialized expertise, and we have credentials and we have all. And so when you go into a university, it looks like a coherent system, but it's really a collection of independent cottage industries. And they're clustered in departments, sometimes in schools, but mostly it's in the individuals. And so that is really, really difficult to do, to break it, to have impact on that. So the the the, the question in general is that, again, it goes back to if there's one thing that we bring to the table compared to other fields, other disciplines, and everything else is an intentional, conscious part of the field is to recognize the big picture, to expand the boundaries that in order to be able to do that's what a systems perspective gives you is to say, wait a minute, you've got to look at all the different factors, or at least the ones that are critical, and your context and how you operate within that. The people, my experience has been that it's very rare that people who focus only on their own specialized interests or their domains of expertise or anything else are rarely going to be willing or interested in to open up to other areas because we all like to be successful. We know how to do things. We do this, or we're going to, et cetera. So it's up to us to reach out and try to engage others, in part because we need the substantive expertise, whether it be in the academic sense or a professional sense. You know, I used to build houses as a kid, but I'm not going to, now if I have a problem and I need a plumber, I'm going to call a plumber. I want a good plumber. I don't care whether they got a good theory of the universe or anything else. I want them to be a good plumber, can do it at a reasonable price, and the same thing with all the other ways that I interact in the world. They don't worry about doing anything other than plumbing. That's what they do. The rest of us, we all go to dinners and take care of social responsibilities and parental responsibilities, but we don't reach out beyond that. But if systems people know that we can't make significant progress if we just do it on our own and only on our own insights. And it requires initiating. So that reaching out, the specialization, and it's easier for us to reach out and cut across that difference, the gap between us and the specialist than is the other way around because they don't see the need. We see the need and we see the benefit for us for doing so. And of course, I think within the academic world, it becomes so entrenched because again, we're all cottage industries. You're king or queen in your own classroom with your students. And so in some ways and there are people who are experts in different fields. They know far more about that field and they think that field's the most important field in the world. And they don't need to look out or branch out to others. This is a gross characterization. I don't think it's so. That's what's happened in terms of in general. The systems education programs, to go back to your first question, is they ran into this this it's hard to be an interdisciplinary, but especially harder to be a transdisciplinary or a metadisciplinary program within the academy, even as much as it's opening up. But then on top of it, you have this situation where, there's no skin in the game. There's no motivation for them to reach out. If they want to make progress as a professor, we all know, for those of you who are professors or grad students, it's how do you get tenure? How do you publish? I didn't publish much. I did what I wanted and I ended up getting tenure early and I could do the things I wanted. But within the university, the programs, the systems programs that lasted longer or seemed to thrive are the ones that did two things. They reached out to address, they had common interests, especially, so for example, take the Open University in England. They would reach out because they had a long-standing program, long before Hull. And they would reach out to others and say, these issues that we're dealing with, these wicked issues, we need expertise from lots of different fields. So they bring people with lots of different backgrounds. The other thing that was in common, Marcus, specifically, I think, is that the heavy emphasis on the use of computers to model and simulate, which is great. But the thing about information technology is that is easy to transfer across different fields. as more and more people have been using digital devices. That doesn't mean they're doing more modeling, but they can see how to do a model. So one of the value of system dynamics, and I know you've done a lot of work on system dynamics. To me, it's basically a methodology. It was called system dynamics. If you go back through the history and you take a look at it, and I did just recently, but um, it was called industrial dynamics. And the focus was on how do you model or understand these interactions. They didn't talk about it in terms of behaviors between agents, but how do you look at these? And they're circular, they're connected. So the question was, Jay Forrester and the others that started getting into it was say, how do we help people understand this interconnected aspects? And so there's a common focus on feedback and circular causality. Um, And it was, again, industrial dynamics. And after a while, Forrester and the others said, this is Jay Forrester, not Heinz von Forrester, said, no, that's not enough. It's a bad language. And what did they wanted to focus? And they picked on systems because it was a general. They don't have a strong vested knowledge base within what we would call systems thinking or system science. It's based on, so it's the use of the language. It's a generic term. Everybody talks about system. Now, on the other hand, it is really much easier to get people engaged in having a conversation if you can have a way of visualizing it and putting it out so that they can contribute their expertise, they can see where they fit. So the value of system dynamics, to me, at a meta level, is the same as Stafford's work on the viable system model. It's a great place to start a conversation and to anchor it, so that people from different backgrounds, even if they don't have expertise in the particular methodology or the theory, you're talking about a common concern, what's happening at the hospital or in your community, or if you're doing the big picture stuff. Some of the conversations I had at the senior levels of the Pentagon, well, how do you develop a national strategy for the country after the end of the Cold War? And it's much easier to come in and say, here's an issue, we see these elements, let's just start diagramming. Just give me some magic markers and a flip chart or a whiteboard to get them involved. So the power of the VSM and the power of system dynamics is that, and those elements, is that it's a way of structuring a conversation around shared interests. And what happens often is that people learn from each other. That there isn't any one expert in the room that's going to give the answer. They're going to create it by working on it together. So my point, long-winded, but my point was is that the systems programs that have prospered and remained viable in the last 60 years partly were aided by when they could use computers and information technology and other associated methodologies to address common concerns, because computers and digital devices, even if you're not doing modeling in the sense of what Forrester was doing, others, that's ubiquitous. For those of you who've been in academics for a long time, remember, the last department in the university to start putting a computer in the office of each professor was the English department. But the first one was in the engineering departments or the business school. But so information technology is a common device for that people are comfortable using, especially now. And so I think the characteristics, if you look at the characteristics of the programs, and we'll know more after we get all the different contributions for this special issue we're putting together, see what's occurred. So it's not just anecdotal. But one of the elements is that information technology, and especially those people who think cybernetics is only about information technology and computers, it's a part, but it's not the primary part. We're going to see that I think those trends, the programs that have been viable and alive, either the emphasis in the technology or the emphasis in practical issues like management, especially management school, business schools, and other professional domains like healthcare, etc.
Thank you.
Thank you, Marcus,
Thank you
and
very much, Bill.
thank you very much, Marcus and Bill. Well, we've come to the end of the webinar, and I don't see any more questions, and we need to conclude sooner than later. So anyway, I think that it's been fascinating. Lots of open questions that I think that we'll need to revisit, and very much looking forward to see the special issue that you are leading and we are contributing to, and just lots of really interesting insights. So thank you very much, Bill. Really, really fascinating
Thank you.
conversation. Listening
I
from you and your experience, fantastic. Thank you. Thank you.
Well,
very much.
thank you for initiating the conversation, because it was out of our conversation that led me to then organize this way, and actually came up with some things. I said, "Oh yeah, that's a good point. I'd like to make that." And of course, it's nice to be able to tie it explicitly into Stafford when I was thinking about the roots of my interactions with him over the years.
Yeah,
Again, his insights, as I shared with you and John the other day, they're not just limited, in my view, to organizational dynamics and management. They're really at the heart of how do we enhance the viability of the species in the context that we're in, which is on this planet. And we have to develop the capabilities, the requisite variety to be able to do that. And he offers, if not the best, one of the very best tangible ways of focusing attention right on that it's about viability. If you don't last long enough to be able to do something, then it doesn't matter how good you are
Yeah,
at selling. So
absolutely. And well, I think that you leave us with a very big open questions that perhaps we need to organize another conversation to go back into the bigger questions that you have opened, because we didn't have time
I'd
to
be
go
happy to
into
be involved in that conversation. And I'm now going to be sitting in on more and more of these now that I know what you're actually doing. I knew the interest, but it wasn't until you and I connected. I'd done some work with Peter Tuddenham over the years and others in Atlanta, et cetera. But I'm looking forward to this. This is great.
Thank you. And
So
thank you
thank you.
for everyone commenting in the chat. Also, very interesting comments in the chat. So we will share the chat as well, and we will publish the video in our YouTube channel. So
Okay.
thank you, everyone. Thank you.
Look forward to it. Thank you. Catch
Okay.
you later.
Thank you, Bill.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.